Hey everyone, it's Justin here, America's Honest Tax Accountant from Number Crunch Nerds. So the question of the day is, what is one of the biggest RMD traps that everybody completely forgets about until it's too late? Well, let's see if we can figure it out. So right here we have Gary and Melissa Perkins. Now the Perkins family has been learning a lot about Roth IRA conversions, and they've laid out their income in similar fashion to what we saw in last week's video on excess Medicare surcharges. If you recall, this was last week's video right here on IRMAA and the excess charges that you can incur if you don't plan for IRMAA appropriately. So going back up here, this is the Perkins family projected taxable income before doing any Roth conversion planning. We're going to see the same pattern of income that we have generally been working with when discussing Roth conversions on the channel. First, we're going to have the employment years. The Perkins family is going to be at AGI of about $325,000 during that time. We're going to ignore inflation. We're going to ignore cost of living adjustments and just keep it simple. We're going to be using a standard deduction of $30,000 for married filing joint throughout the example. Again, we're going to ignore inflation adjustments. We're going to ignore the senior bump. We're just going to keep the math simple and focus on the concept. And so taxable income for the Perkins family before conversion during the employment years is going to be $295,000. Then we're going to see the early retirement drop. That's another part of the standard income pattern as people transition from the employment to the retirement years. We're going to have AGI drop off to $120,000 during those years. We're going to assume that the Perkins family pushed out Social Security and any pensions, if applicable, to the age of 70 as the start date. So we're going to see the Social Security and pension bump kick in right here. And then we're going to get down here into the RMD years where we will see the income pick up again. We'll have that go up to $275,000. Once again, it's not always going to be exactly the same every year, but we're keeping the math simple and focusing on the concept. And so that's what we're going to estimate for the 20 RMD years that are included in this example. We're going to assume that Mr. and Mrs. Perkins are the same age and that their life expectancy is 93. And so taxable income in those years before any conversion is going to be $245,000. Now, Gary Perkins is pretty sure he's got this whole Roth conversion thing figured out. The whole point of Roth conversion, he tells his wife Melissa, is to get our income out of the higher brackets in future RMD years and into the lower brackets in earlier years. We just need to figure out where we have room in those lower brackets in the earlier years. So the Perkins family begins their analysis by identifying where their future projections land them within the income tax brackets before doing any conversions. So starting right here in the employment years, they have $295,000 of taxable income. $295,000 is going to be more than the top of the 22% bracket at $206,700, but it's going to be less than the top of the 24% bracket at $394,600. So the Perkins marginal tax rate in the employment years is going to be 24%. Now, just to be clear, we are going to do exactly the same thing in this video as we did in last week's video on the IRMAA surcharges. For simplicity, we are just going to assume that the 2025 income tax brackets are what's going to apply to this entire example. Obviously, within the personal tax planning template for the many of you that are in that program, we do have the inflation adjustments built in so that we can grow not only the brackets, difference. But the standard deduction and the cost of living increases and so forth, and we can really hone in on what these numbers are going to be and how these brackets are going to increase over time so that we can truly refine our Roth IRA conversion planning. But again, for mathematical simplicity, just so we can focus on the concept in this example, we will assume these are the brackets the entire time. So here's the Perkins bracket analysis results for this first pass before we do any conversions. As we said, in the employment years, they're looking at a 24% marginal rate. In the early retirement drop years, they are projecting $90,000 of taxable income. That is above the top of the bracket for the 10% rate, but it is below the top of the bracket for the 12% rate. So the Perkins family has a marginal rate of 12% in the early retirement years. Then when Social Security and pensions start to kick in, if applicable, they're going to be up to 1/30 of taxable income. That's going to be above the top of the 12% bracket, but below the top of the 22% bracket. So they're going to have a marginal rate of 22% in those Social Security and pension years. And then ultimately when RMDs kick in, this 245 is going to put them above the top of the 22% bracket, but below the top of the 24% bracket. So again, they're going to be back into the 24% marginal rate during the RMD years. So Gary Perkins breaks out his handy dandy little calculator and says, here's what we're going to do. We're in the 24% bracket for all of the RMD years, but we do have some room right here in the early retirement years as well as the pre-RMD years right here. So we're going to fill up both the 12% and 22% brackets in the 3 early retirement years. Remember, right here there was still a little bit of room in the 12% bracket, and the 22% bracket was completely wide open there. And then in the 3 Social Security years, and by the way, just in case there's any confusion, I'm not saying that Social Security is only occurring in these 3 years. We're just saying that this is where Social Security has started, and it's also pre-RMD. So we're just referring to these 3 years as the Social Security and pension years. But all of these years down here would really be Social Security plus pension plus RMD. And that's why the AGI increases here from the early retirement drop years and then increases again in the RMD years. I'm confident most of you were following that, but I just want to make sure, since we're using the phrase right here, the 3 Social Security years. So continuing with the example, since we're already at 85% taxable on Social Security with $160,000 of income before conversion, again, just to be clear, remember what Gary is saying here is that with $160,000 of AGI already, the Social Security that the Perkins family receives is already going to be 85% taxable. So that is no longer a factor to consider. In other words, like, am I going to make Social Security 85% taxable now when it previously wasn't 85% taxable by considering a Roth conversion? That would not be applicable here because they already have enough income anyway before even considering Roth conversions to make that Social Security 85% taxable. So going back down here, since that's already the case with Social Security, we're just going to go ahead and fill up the 22% bracket. In other words, he's going to get as much income as he can out of the 24% bracket here in the RMD years and just fill up this 22% bracket all the way for the 3-year period that's included in this section right here. Because why not? Why would you want to pay 24% when you could pay 22%? And then Gary says, continuing with the example, in the 8 employment years, which are at the beginning part of the example, we're already in the 24% bracket. So there's not really anything that we can do there. In other words, Gary is looking at this chart and saying, well, since we're already at the 24% marginal rate here, what would be the point of doing a conversion out of the 24% rate here? We're not getting it into a lower rate right there. So we're just going to focus on these 3 years here when we're at the 12% marginal rate before conversion. And then we're going to focus on these 3 years right here when we're in the 22% rate before conversion. And that's pretty much going to be the end of it as far as Gary Perkins is concerned. There's nothing we can really do with the 8 employment years in this fact pattern. So the Perkins family finishes up their conversion planning. They've successfully reduced their lifetime tax burden by shifting income out of the 24% bracket in later years and into the 12% and 22% brackets in 6 of the earlier years. So now that they're done, they head out to the golf course to enjoy their retirement. Now, Wayne and Susie Weaver are friends with the Perkins family. They also play golf at the same club and ironically have the identical income profile as Gary and Melissa Perkins. But Wayne and Susie are real thinkers. They're not exactly sure that they've got it all figured out about this Roth conversion thing the way that Gary Perkins thought that he did. The Weavers think, you know what, there might be a little bit more to it, and we're not talking about IRMAA right now. If you want to learn more about IRMAA considerations, last week's video that I mentioned before is for you. So the Weavers take a close look at their projected income and tax bracket analysis, and we don't have to belabor this section right here because, as you might expect, it is exactly the same as the Perkins family. For purposes of the before Roth conversion planning, both the Perkins family and the Weaver family have identical income projections. So the Weavers, just like the Perkins family, they see the room in the 12% and 22% brackets in the early retirement years. That's right here in this section. That's exactly the same thing as what we went over with the Perkins family. They also see the room in the 22% bracket in the Social Security years. Again, that is identical to what we just went over with the Perkins family above for this section. But Wayne Weaver sees something else. He says, you know what we're going to do? We're going to convert even more out of the RMD years, and we're going to fill up the 24% bracket in the 8 employment years. Wayne says, look at that. There is nearly $100,000 of room in the 24% bracket in each of those 8 employment years. What Wayne is talking about right here is we have $295,000 of taxable income in those 8 years. Again, that is identical to the Perkins family. But the top of the 24% bracket, which remember we are assuming is applicable for this entire example, is $394,000, almost $395,000. But the amount of taxable income we currently have is $295,000. So there's $100,000 of room between these numbers here and the top of the 24% bracket there. Yes, it's true that the Weaver family is already in the 24% bracket in these 8 years, but the 24% bracket is not full. They can still fill up the 24% bracket to the tune of about $100,000 in each of these years. So to summarize, what the Weaver family is going to do is they will still fill up this 12% bracket right here. They will still fill up the 22% bracket that is wide open in this section. They will still fill up the 22% bracket that is open here in these 3 years. All of that is the same as the Perkins family. But then they're planning to convert out of the RMD years and into the employment years to the tune of $100,000 annually to fill up this 24% bracket. All right, now Gary and Melissa Perkins are out on the back nine, and they get wind of what the Weaver family is planning for their Roth conversion strategy through some mutual friends that the Weavers were talking to in the Clubhouse about this. Wayne is such a fool, Gary Perkins says, laughing with his wife. Can you even believe it? He's converting out of the 24% bracket in RMD years, and into the 24% bracket in employment years. And Melissa Perkins laughing, I know, right? I told you he wasn't playing with a full deck. Wayne probably also thinks that buffalo wings are made from actual buffalo. Okay, now, let's go back to the future. The year is 2057. Melissa Perkins is looking over the Roth conversion analysis that she and Gary had so confidently prepared all those years ago. Something about it had been flawed. Take a look at this analysis alongside Melissa. What is wrong with it? What is wrong with this right here? What sticks out like a sore thumb? What was the problem here? What did Gary miss? He died. Gary Perkins passed at the age of 78 in 2042. It was just one of those things and nobody saw it coming. But he did have 78 strong and happy years. Nothing that anybody could reasonably be upset about. But Gary never factored his ultimate demise into his tax planning. A common mistake. Which means all of this is wrong. This filing status right here for the 15 years between 2043 and 2057, this filing status is wrong. This standard deduction right here is wrong. This taxable income right here is wrong, which in this fact pattern means that this is also wrong. This 24% marginal rate analysis right here is wrong. Melissa wasn't in the 24% bracket for the last 15 years of her life. Gary's traditional IRAs became her IRAs, and she had to deal with both her RMDs and Gary's RMDs in the single tax brackets. Here's the 2025 income tax brackets for married filing joint. Here's the 2025 income tax brackets for single. Again, for simplicity, we are ignoring inflation adjustments and we are assuming that these two sets of brackets apply to the entire example. We are also assuming that Melissa Perkins did not remarry. If surviving spouse is going to remarry, or you have a suspicion that surviving spouse might remarry, or surviving spouse is not the financially savvy one in the family, then you want to sit down with an estate planning attorney as soon as possible and set up the necessary trust or other structures to protect surviving spouse from any potential new spouse who basically could run away with all the money. But for this example, we're going to assume that Melissa Perkins did not remarry, which by the way is a very common situation for many surviving spouses. So comparing the first four brackets right here for Melissa for the last 15 years of her life, she's losing about half the bracket. This 11,925 is about half of this right here. This 48,475 is half of this right over here. And the same with the 22% bracket. And the same with the 24% bracket. But look at the taxable income in these final 15 years. It's up to $260,000 now because that standard deduction just got cut in half from $30,000 that we were using for married filing joint to $15,000, which is what we will just assume is applicable to a single individual for purposes of this example, ignoring inflation adjustments again, ignoring the senior bump. So at $260,000 of taxable income, Melissa Perkins is above the threshold for the 32% bracket, and she has now been bumped up into the 35% bracket. She is no longer getting taxed at only 24%, which is what Gary Perkins was originally thinking during his analysis. Melissa Perkins' 32% bracket is now completely full. That is an 8% differential right there for every year of that 15-year period. 8% more tax on every dollar that falls into this bracket, with all of the remaining amount getting bumped up to 35%. 15 years of getting hammered in the 32 and 35% brackets. It was almost like she got run over by a buffalo. And she finally realized that something her late husband Gary used to say say was right. But it was also incomplete. Gary used to say the whole point of a Roth conversion is to get our income out of the higher brackets in future RMD years and into the lower brackets in earlier years. But the incomplete part is that higher brackets in future years is going to be heavily impacted by a change in filing status. Something that people who have been married filing joint for decades often forget about. That, as many of you know, is called the widow's penalty. And the transition from married filing joint to single is statistically not an if. It is very common to see one spouse outlive the other by 10 years or more, particularly if one, often the gentleman, is older than his wife to begin with. Now, Wayne Weaver ironically also passed at age 78 in this example, but Wayne and Susie had taken a different approach to their planning as compared to the Perkins family. The first thing they did was to look well into the future, and they decided that, hey, even though we don't like to talk about it, statistically one of us is going to pass before the other. Now, of course, they didn't know who was going to pass first. They didn't know in what year it would happen. So just like the rest of us when it comes to tax planning, they had to make some planning assumptions. And based on their facts and circumstances, they decided that starting at age 81, they would attempt to get their income to be no higher than in the 22% bracket. And here's the key, based on the single brackets, not on the married filing joint brackets. In other words, they are preemptively planning for the single brackets right from the start. Even back here when they're both still employed and they're laying out their lifetime tax plan inside the personal tax planning template, they are preemptively planning for the single brackets later in life right from the beginning. That is how you plan for the inevitability that most couples will be hit with widow's penalty if you do not plan accordingly. So the Weaver family grabbed their single bracket table and they said, you know what? Starting in this year, and we're talking about this section of the chart from 81 years old down to life expectancy, we want to convert such that taxable income doesn't exceed $103,350, where that $103,350 is the top of the 22% bracket for single bracket purposes, which again, for simplicity, we are assuming applies to the entire example. But of course, inside the personal tax planning template, as many of you know, we're going to grow this bracket for inflation adjustments so we can calculate with more precision what this will actually look like in these future years, even though we're keeping the math simple for purposes of this example. So right here on the Weaver family's actual taxable income after the Roth conversion planning, right here they've laid out the top of their desired bracket. So again, right here at 81 years old and down, we have the top of the 22% bracket for single bracket purposes. The Weavers are also going to try to limit their income to the 24% bracket for single bracket purposes, starting at age 73 and going out to age 80. Now, of course, as I said, they're doing this way back here. They don't know exactly what their life expectancy truly will be. They're planning for at least one person to live to be mid-90s, but they're also planning right here from a bracket perspective to try to stay within the 22 and 24% brackets for single purposes, even though the reality of the situation turned out that they were married filing joint up to 78, and then Mrs. Weaver switched to single at age 79. They were planning for single starting at 81, so they were off by a couple of years, as most people probably will be. Obviously, you can't know exactly when your ultimate demise is coming, but you can plan with realistic expectations based on your facts and circumstances, based on your health, based on many other factors in your life, perhaps what a reasonable expectation would be for your and your spouse's situation, when you could at least say, what happens if one spouse, it could be one or the other, passes at a certain age and we plan for single from that point forward. Alright, so for members of the Personal Tax Planning Template Program, we are going to comb through the details of the widow's penalty results, as well as the widow's penalty for IRMAA results for both the Perkins family and the Weaver family, which I have located in these two tabs right down here inside the members area. Those detailed analysis videos, including the IRMAA results, have been uploaded to the members area, so you can simply log in at your convenience and check those out. Remember, widow's penalty, including for IRMAA, is not an if for most families. Statistically, one spouse will outlive the other, often for a decade or more. If you do not plan for it, you are going to get hit. So I suggest that you study these detailed analysis videos carefully and make sure that you are incorporating planning for widow's penalty into your overall personal tax planning template analysis. And if you're new to the channel and just becoming familiar with the personal tax planning template, we do have the toggle switches to go between married filing joint and single, starting in any year desired for your planning, and that is both for income tax purposes as well as IRMAA built into the template. You can see right here on the face of the personal tax planning template, this one is for income tax purposes. These are the toggle switches right here, and that's what we can use to test the results from transitioning from a married filing joint filing status into the single brackets further out. My personal tax planning template program is arguably the most complete and comprehensive individual income tax planning training program on the market in the United States today. So if you're not already a member, lifetime access to the personal tax planning template and video training program is available for a one-time purchase fee at the link in the description below this video. Take a look at some of these recent comments by members of the program. Justin, your videos are so detailed and understandable. Thank you for helping us, primarily old school retirees. And over here, thanks again for all your hard work and excellent education material. It is helping me to no end figuring out our future retirement taxes, Roth conversion, and trying different distribution strategies. And right down here, Justin, your spreadsheet is amazing, as is all of the work you've put into the videos within the members area of the personal tax planning template. It's like having a financial advisor report whenever I want for whatever changes happen or that I want to model. And then finally, right over here, Justin, I wish I had paid more attention to the tax implications of retirement when I hit 60, and I have encouraged others to learn from my mistakes. I'm now turning 73 this year and am facing large RMDs. As I said, you can join the personal tax planning template program with lifetime access for a one-time access fee at the link in the description below this video. And that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you next time.